There comes a moment in a person's inner life when something strange happens. They do not break, they do not cry, they do not react. They simply stop responding the way they used to. And that silence is not emptiness. It is awakening. Because the final stage of spiritual awakening is not enlightenment with light and bliss. It is the day the empath stops caring the way they used to. If this resonates with something you've lived through, stay with this message, because what comes next explains why this not caring is actually the highest form of emotional intelligence the psyche can reach. Emotional exhaustion in the empath is not simply tiredness in the ordinary sense, but a deeper collapse of an inner system that was built on constant emotional overextension. For a long time, the empath functions like an open channel, absorbing not only their own feelings, but also the unresolved emotional states of others. They become skilled at reading subtle shifts in tone, micro-expressions, and unspoken tensions, and over time this sensitivity turns into responsibility. They begin to believe, often unconsciously, that if they can understand someone deeply enough, they can also stabilize them, fix them, or prevent their suffering from escalating. But what is not immediately visible is the cost of this adaptation. Every act of emotional absorption requires internal space, and that space is not infinite. The empath gradually starts replacing their own emotional needs with the emotional needs of others. Their identity becomes organized around response rather than presence. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" they begin asking, "What do they need from me right now?" This shift appears compassionate on the surface, but internally it creates a fragmentation where the self is always slightly delayed, always slightly secondary. Over time, the nervous system begins to register this imbalance. What was once sensitivity starts to feel like overload. The body reacts before the mind can rationalize it. Fatigue after conversations, emotional numbness after prolonged exposure to others' pain, or a subtle sense of detachment that was not consciously chosen. This is not emotional weakness, but a protective recalibration attempting to restore equilibrium. The breaking point does not arrive loudly. It arrives as a quiet refusal. The same emotional reflex that once rushed to fix, soothe, or explain begins to hesitate. Not because compassion is gone, but because the system that supported compulsive giving is no longer sustainable. The empath begins to notice that their care was often flowing in one direction, rarely returning to replenish them. And in that realization, emotional exhaustion stops being a symptom and becomes a message. It reveals that what was called love was often indistinguishable from self-erasure, and the collapse is simply the psyche withdrawing from a pattern that can no longer be maintained without losing the self in the process. The empath's care often begins as a genuine sensitivity to the emotional reality of others, but over time it transforms into something more complex and less conscious. A learned reflex of self-neglect disguised as love. In the beginning, they do not distinguish between feeling with someone and carrying someone. They experience emotional states so vividly that separation becomes difficult, and this creates an unconscious assumption that relief for others must come through their involvement. Care becomes active, constant, and often compulsive, as if silence would mean abandonment. But beneath this pattern, something subtle begins to form. The empath slowly loses the boundary between compassion and obligation. They start to feel responsible for emotional outcomes that were never theirs to control. If someone is unhappy, they feel compelled to fix it. If someone is distant, they feel compelled to restore connection. If someone is in pain, they feel compelled to absorb it. This creates an invisible loop where their sense of worth becomes tied to their usefulness in emotional situations. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize is that it feels like love. It feels noble. It feels meaningful. Yet internally, it is often driven by an unconscious fear that if they stop giving, they will lose connection, relevance, or belonging. So they continue, even when depleted, even when unseen, even when it costs them their inner stability. Over time, this pattern begins to erase the self. Their emotional world becomes saturated with external needs, leaving little room for their own inner voice. They may not notice it at first because they are still feeling deeply, but the direction of that feeling is always outward. The self becomes a background presence, something attended to only when everything else is resolved, which of course rarely happens. Eventually, the psyche begins to register the imbalance, not as meaning, but as fatigue. The same sensitivity that once created connection begins to create overwhelm. Care starts to feel heavy instead of fulfilling. And in that shift, a deeper truth emerges. What they called care was often an unexamined pattern of emotional over-responsibility, where love was expressed through sacrifice rather than presence, and where connection required disappearance of the self to remain intact. Awakening, in its real psychological sense, does not begin with light or expansion, but with disillusionment, a quiet, internal correction where what once felt meaningful no longer produces the same emotional return. For the empath, this shift is often gradual and almost unnoticeable at first. They continue giving, continue understanding, continue holding space for others, but something subtle has changed in the background. The emotional reward system no longer responds in the same way. Where there was once a sense of purpose in overgiving, there is now a faint emptiness that follows it. Acts of care that used to feel alive begin to feel repetitive, mechanical, or strangely disconnected from the self. This is not because compassion has vanished, but because the unconscious expectation attached to it is dissolving. The empath begins to realize that their giving was often tied to an invisible exchange. If I care enough, I will be valued. If I understand enough, I will be needed. If I sacrifice enough, I will be safe in connection. Disillusionment enters when this hidden contract stops working. People may still receive their care, but the response is not what it once was. Recognition feels inconsistent. Appreciation feels insufficient. Emotional reciprocity feels unpredictable. And slowly, the psyche begins to question the structure it has been operating under for so long. Not in anger, but in quiet observation. This is where awakening begins to differentiate itself from suffering. Suffering clings to meaning and tries to repair the old pattern. Awakening stops trying to repair and starts observing the pattern itself. The empath begins to notice that their exhaustion was not caused by caring too much, but by caring in a direction that never included themselves. As this recognition deepens, emotional attachment to outcome weakens. The need for responses, validation, or emotional closure begins to lose its urgency. What remains is a more neutral awareness, seeing people as they are, not as extensions of emotional responsibility. This stage is often mistaken for emotional numbness, but it is actually the beginning of clarity without distortion. The empath is no longer projecting meaning onto every interaction. They are no longer inflating emotional responsibility beyond its natural limits. And in this reduction of distortion, reality becomes sharper, quieter, and more honest than anything they experienced while entangled in overcare, even if it initially feels like loss rather than liberation. The moment an empath stops rescuing others is not a sudden decision, but a psychological turning point where inner energy stops flowing into patterns that repeatedly dissolve the self. For a long time, their identity is structured around intervention, stepping in, smoothing emotional chaos, explaining pain, absorbing tension, and trying to restore balance in relationships that are inherently unstable. This creates a deep internal belief that emotional disorder is something they are meant to correct. But over time, experience begins to accumulate in a different direction. They start noticing that their involvement does not produce lasting transformation in others, but rather temporary relief followed by repetition of the same cycles. The same dynamics return, the same emotional patterns reappear, and the same role is silently expected from them again. What once felt like purpose slowly reveals itself as repetition without resolution. In this space of accumulated awareness, something important begins to shift internally. The empath starts to recognize that their rescuing behavior was not neutral. It was sustaining systems that never required them to disappear into the process. In trying to stabilize others, they were unintentionally destabilizing themselves. Their presence became conditional upon emotional emergencies, and their value became tied to being needed in moments of crisis. When this realization deepens, the emotional impulse to step in begins to weaken. Not because they no longer care, but because care is no longer automatically translated into intervention. A new space opens between stimulus and response, and in that space, choice appears for the first time. They can witness someone's struggle without immediately converting it into personal responsibility. This is where the psychological break from rescuing occurs. The empath begins to see that not every emotional imbalance requires their participation, and not every silence needs to be filled with their effort. They start to differentiate between empathy and entanglement, between awareness and ownership of another person's emotional state. What follows is often misinterpreted by others as withdrawal, but internally it is the restoration of boundaries that were previously dissolved. The urge to fix becomes optional instead of automatic. The need to carry emotional weight that does not belong to them begins to fade. And in that fading, a quieter form of presence emerges. One that can observe suffering without being consumed by it, and that can remain connected without losing structural integrity of the self in the process. Disillusionment is often mistaken for emotional darkness because it strips away the comforting illusions that once gave emotional experiences their meaning. But in its deeper psychological function, it is not a descent into negativity. It is the removal of distortion. For the empath, this stage arrives when the internal narrative that once justified overgiving, over-understanding, and over-absorbing no longer holds its emotional authority. At first, there is resistance. The mind tries to reattach meaning to old patterns. Maybe I just need better boundaries, or maybe I wasn't loving correctly. But beneath these rationalizations, something more fundamental is changing. The emotional reward that once came from being needed, being the helper, or being the one who understands everything, begins to fade. The same actions are still possible, but they no longer produce the same inner validation. This creates a strange internal silence. Not painful in the dramatic sense, but unfamiliar. The empath is no longer emotionally seduced by the role they once played. Situations that used to trigger immediate engagement now feel slower internally, as if something in the psyche has stepped back just enough to observe instead of merge. And in that distance, clarity begins to form. They start seeing patterns instead of moments, repetition instead of uniqueness, emotional dependency instead of genuine reciprocity. What once felt like deep connection begins to reveal itself as emotional repetition cycles, where roles are unconsciously assigned and replayed. The empath was often the stabilizer, the absorber, the interpreter of others' emotional chaos, but rarely an equal participant in mutual emotional balance. This realization does not bring collapse. It brings correction. Because what disappears is not love, but the distorted framework through which love was previously interpreted. The psyche stops mistaking intensity for depth and neediness for connection. In this space, emotional clarity begins to replace emotional immersion. The empath no longer feels compelled to merge with every emotional wave they encounter. Instead, they observe without absorption. They recognize pain without inheriting it. They acknowledge struggle without turning it into personal responsibility. And this shift is precisely why disillusionment is not darkness. It is the end of unconscious participation in emotional illusions that required self-abandonment to sustain themselves, and the beginning of perception that is no longer filtered through the need to be needed, but grounded in awareness that can finally distinguish between what is theirs and what was never meant to be carried at all. Detachment, in its true psychological sense, is often misunderstood as emotional coldness, but for the empath, it is actually the return of inner sovereignty after prolonged emotional diffusion. For a long time, their emotional system operated in a state of openness where boundaries between self and others were blurred. They did not just witness emotional states. They absorbed them, translated them, and often carried them as if they were personally responsible for resolving them. As this pattern continues over time, the psyche begins a quiet correction. It does not shut down feeling, it reorganizes it. The empath begins to experience a new kind of internal spacing between stimulus and response. Where there was once immediate emotional fusion, there is now a moment of pause. In that pause, something essential changes. The automatic need to merge disappears. This is where detachment begins to emerge, not as rejection of others, but as the restoration of internal separation. The empath starts to notice that they can perceive another person's emotional state without entering it. They can understand suffering without absorbing its weight. They can witness intensity without becoming internally destabilized by it. At first, this feels unfamiliar. The old identity was built around emotional permeability, so this new state can be misinterpreted as numbness. But what is actually happening is a redistribution of emotional responsibility. Feelings are no longer being outsourced to external chaos. The inner world is no longer constantly rearranging itself around the emotional fluctuations of others. In this state, something subtle but profound becomes visible. The empath is no longer governed by emotional urgency. They are no longer pulled into immediate reaction as a form of survival or connection. Instead, they begin to respond from presence rather than compulsion. Choices become conscious rather than reflexive. This shift also reveals how much of their previous care was actually emotional over-involvement disguised as connection. Detachment removes that compulsion. It does not remove awareness, compassion, or understanding. It removes the need to lose oneself in order to remain connected. And as this process stabilizes, a new internal order forms. The empath begins to experience emotional neutrality, not as emptiness, but as clarity without distortion. They are no longer emotionally scattered across every interaction. Their energy returns inward, forming a stable center that is not easily disrupted by external emotional turbulence. In this restored state, detachment is no longer absence of feeling, but the presence of boundaries that finally allow feeling to exist without collapse of the self into everything it perceives. Healing completes for the empath not when they become unaffected, but when they no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional truth. For a long time, their inner world was organized around external validation, where peace depended on how others responded, and emotional stability was constantly negotiated through relationships. Every reaction, every silence, every shift in tone had the power to reorganize their internal state. But as the deeper process of awareness unfolds, something fundamental begins to change. The empath starts to notice that their emotional equilibrium does not actually require external approval to exist. What once felt like essential feedback from others begins to lose its authority over their internal condition. The nervous system slowly learns that it does not need to remain in constant readiness for emotional disruption. This realization does not arrive as a single insight. It accumulates through repeated experiences where expected emotional reactions no longer occur, where approval is given but no longer felt as stabilizing, and where disapproval no longer collapses the internal sense of worth. Each of these moments quietly weakens the old structure in which outer response dictated inner state. As this structure dissolves, the empath begins to experience something unfamiliar but profoundly stabilizing, a sense of internal continuity that does not fluctuate with relational dynamics. They are still aware of others, still capable of empathy, still able to understand emotional complexity, but they are no longer dependent on emotional feedback loops to feel whole. This is where the conditioning of self-abandonment finally loses its grip. The compulsion to earn peace through emotional performance fades. The need to maintain harmony at the cost of inner truth begins to feel unnecessary. And in its place, a quieter form of awareness emerges, one that does not require constant emotional adjustment to remain stable. Healing, in this sense, is not about becoming unaffected by life, but about becoming ungoverned by it. The empath no longer measures their worth through how deeply they can feel for others or how much they can endure for connection. Instead, they begin to recognize that emotional stability is not something granted by relationships, but something that arises when the self is no longer fragmented by the need to be accepted in order to feel real. In this stabilized awareness, emotional experience becomes less about survival and more about perception. Feelings still arise, but they no longer dictate identity. Approval is no longer a requirement for inner peace, and disapproval no longer defines emotional collapse. What remains is a steady internal presence that does not depend on external conditions to maintain its sense of coherence, and in that coherence, healing completes not as an ending, but as a return to psychological wholeness that was never truly absent, only forgotten beneath layers of emotional over-adaptation. The final stage is often misunderstood as emotional numbness, but what actually emerges is something far more precise: conscious neutrality. It is the point where the empath no longer oscillates between emotional over-involvement and emotional depletion, because both patterns have been recognized and released. What remains is a stable inner position that does not require emotional extremes to feel alive or meaningful. In earlier stages, emotional experience was always tied to polarity. There was either deep immersion in others' states or withdrawal after exhaustion. Care was intense but unstable. Compassion often carried hidden cost. Even silence had emotional weight because it was interpreted through attachment and expectation. The internal world was constantly reacting, adjusting, and compensating for external emotional fluctuations. But as awareness deepens, something reorganizes at the root level of perception. The empath begins to notice that emotional intensity is not the same as emotional clarity. They start to see that many of their previous reactions were not responses to reality itself, but responses to interpretations shaped by old conditioning. This recognition gradually dissolves the automatic emotional reactivity that once governed their inner life. In this neutral state, perception becomes cleaner. Situations are no longer filtered through the need to fix, rescue, or emotionally merge. People are seen as separate psychological systems rather than emotional extensions of the self. Pain is recognized without absorption. Distance is accepted without interpretation as rejection. Connection is experienced without the compulsion to dissolve personal boundaries. What appears as not caring from the outside is actually the absence of compulsive emotional entanglement. The empath is still aware, still capable of understanding depth, still sensitive to subtle emotional shifts, but none of it overrides their internal stability anymore. Emotional awareness no longer comes with emotional ownership. This is why conscious neutrality feels so different from earlier states. It is not emptiness because perception is still active. It is not detachment in the sense of disconnection because presence is still intact. It is a form of inner alignment where emotional experience no longer dictates identity or disrupts coherence. In this final stage, the psyche is no longer trying to resolve itself through others. The need to be validated, needed, or emotionally entangled has dissolved into awareness. What remains is a steady internal field that can observe life as it is without distortion from over-identification. And in that stillness, the empath is no longer defined by how deeply they feel for others, but by the fact that feeling no longer requires self-abandonment to exist in its natural form.